I used to think that Israel occupies Palestine, but after going to Palestine, I realized Israel occupies everywhere else except Palestine. There is an essential need of ulama now bringing our discussions, raising the caliber of our discussions, where we need to counter atheist arguments.
What you mention is some of the young people are willing to move forward. So the young people should re-identify themselves as Hanafi Maturidi.
The hijab is something Allah has commanded the believing women, but He has also commanded the men with certain things also, like lowering the gaze, keeping their modesty. So if men do not conform to that law, they are answerable to Allah. If women do not conform to that law, they are answerable to Allah. And this helped informing my personality of not being institutionalized. And my name is Asrar Rashid. The current occupation is teacher and imam. My earliest studies started with learning surf tables in the late 90s. And then this continued into studying small texts like Nahmid and other texts with some teachers, and then traveling to Syria and studying Arabic in Damascus University, and then continuing my studies with my teacher Rusubak Saidi, and then returning back to Damascus. After which, when I came back from the second visit to Damascus, then I continued with local teachers here in Birmingham, and then went back to Damascus for a third time, and then continued studying up to 2012. From a young age, I was someone who read books on Islam, and then wanting to learn, I ended up going to one of the local institutes and meeting Rusubak Saidi and observing his classes and entering those classes. We would have, when I say we, I mean the number of students that left from Birmingham were many who went to Syria. We could have easily ended up in Egypt or in Yemen or Iraq prior to the war, or in Pakistan. But the divine will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was that we end up in Syria and Damascus. Even today, if I had to return to any country, it would be specifically to Damascus, meaning Damascus in terms of its preservation of knowledge and Al-Izz bin Abdus Salam, Sultanul Ulama, also mentions the superiority of the ulama of Syria. And when they say Syria, they mean specifically Asham. When they say Asham, they mean specifically Damascus. The ulama of Damascus, their superiority to all the ulama of the world in every age. And I personally hold this position. In Syria, I studied various texts under different ulama. So under Sheikh Muhammad Jum'a, we studied texts like Maraq al-Falah, Sharh al-Rahabiyya in Ilm al-Mirath, Inheritance Laws, Kashf al-Haqa'iq, Commentary on Kanz al-Daqa'iq. And this is just with one teacher, Sheikh Muhammad Jum'a, but with numerous other teachers, various texts. One unique aspect of my studies was that I was not the produce of any institutionalized way of thinking. So when I went to a madrasa to study Dars-e-Nizami, I went on my own accord. My parents didn't tell me, and neither was I placed in a hostel madrasa and institutionalized by the madrasa. I would go find the ulama, sit with them, read a text, read a few texts, learn how to read Arabic, learn how to understand the text, and then move from alim to alim. And this helped informing my personality of not being institutionalized. And this is what I would advise the brothers who are listening, that do not be institutionalized by your madrasa. This is something very important for them to understand. I would not make any changes because I believe the experience and the difficulties formulated my personality, as well as this being the divine will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that we come out of different difficulties for a particular divine wisdom. With the knowledge, you would need patience. So the first thing is patience and perseverance, because the initial stages of study are very difficult. And of course, the most important thing is ikhlas and sidq, meaning sincerity and doing it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not for worldly prestige. I do not believe my overall views have changed. I think certain people are beginning to understand me better, and maybe my method of presentation has become more refined. In terms of belief, I will never change my views. In terms of aqaid, inshallah, I will remain the same, as well as those established facts which are made upon mujma' alayh positions, meaning a consensus. But anything else is always viable to change. From the living scholars, I find a Shaykh Nuruddin Itr, one of the most inspiring scholars, as well as Shaykh Ali Sabuni, the Mufassir of the Quran. These are some of the living scholars. And many of the scholars that inspired me have largely passed away. Meaning most of them have passed away. Like Shaykh Sayyid Muhammad bin Alawi al-Maliki, rahimahullah. Many people think I am his student. I am not his formal student. I visited him on various times during various trips, and he gave formal ijazat, which he would give out to students of knowledge generally. So there's a misconception. People think I am his student or I claim to be his student. I am a student of his brother, Sayyid Abbas bin Alawi al-Maliki, and I was very close to him. I got to know him in 2010, and we had a personal student-teacher relationship and a friendship. He passed away in 2015, and I learned a lot regarding a Sayyid Muhammad bin Alawi and their father, a Sayyid Alawi, through a Sayyid Abbas bin Alawi, rahimahumullah. So Shaykh Muhammad bin Alawi al-Maliki is one of the most inspiring scholars. Additional to that, Shaykh Abdullah Sirajuddin, who I never met, but I studied with his student, Shaykh Nuruddin Itr, who is also his son-in-law. And I studied 2 volumes of I'lam al-Anan, his commentary on Bulugh al-Maram, to teach this in Jami' Shamsiyah in Damascus. I would attend every Friday consistently for 2 years, from 2005 and 2006. And then I went back in 2007 and into 2008. I studied parts of I'lam al-Anan with him. But Shaykh Abdullah Sirajuddin, I was introduced to him by Shaykh Zakaria al-Bukhari, rahimahullah. Because when Shaykh Abdullah Sirajuddin passed away in 2001, I was in the residence of Shaykh Zakaria al-Bukhari during the Hajj time. So Shaykh Abdullah Sirajuddin passed away just after the Hajj, and there was a ta'ziyah, meaning people congregated in the house, and I went and I inquired who passed away, and they informed me that there is a sheikh known as a Shaykh Abdullah Sirajuddin. So after my Hajj, I was planning to go to Damascus. I had visited Damascus before for a short trip, but then when I went to Damascus, I acquired many of the books of Shaykh Abdullah Sirajuddin and read those works over the years. And I would say he was one of the most inspiring scholars of our age. Of course, he inspired who? Shaykh Muhammad Awama, who is one of the best scholars that we have today, who is the author of many works, Shaykh Muhammad Awama, but many other ulama also. Yes, so my visit to Palestine was an eye-opener. So theoretically, we read about Al-Quds al-Sharif and Masjid al-Aqsa, but when you go there and you observe the Haram, because Sultan Salahuddin al-Ayyubi rahimahullah termed the masjid as haram, even though some people reject that term. They say it's not a third haram. The haramain are two. Technically, the Masjid al-Aqsa is not a haram, but I prefer the term haram because it's a sanctified place. When you go there, you will observe all the heritage preserved by the Ottoman Salatin, the rulers who ruled the region, as well as the Ayyubi dynasty, all the places preserved. So that was one aspect that intrigued me. And the effect, remember, all the Anbiya alayhimus salam congregated in al-Masjid al-Aqsa. So it's the only place on earth where all the prophets have congregated. And then the spiritual effect, meaning where a prophet goes becomes a blessed place. So if all the prophets entered that place, it's one of the most blessed sites on the face of the earth. Secondly, what intrigued me was the resistance of the Palestinian people, and especially the people of Al-Quds, because the Hadith states, لا يزال طائفة من أمتي يقاتلون في سبيل الله, that a group of people shall never cease except that they are fighting in the way of Allah. But the Hadith has additions. وَهُمْ عَلَى أَبْوَابِ الْقُدْسِ, they are at the doors of Al-Quds. There is one that mentions Damascus. So because I studied under the scholars of Damascus, I recognize them as a ta'ifatul mansura, the ulama of Damashq. But the second ta'ifa, meaning, is the people of Al-Quds who are fighting the Israeli oppression, the Israeli subjugation of Palestine. But this is something else that I said also, that I used to think that Israel occupies Palestine, but after going to Palestine, I realized Israel occupies everywhere else except Palestine. So the eye-opener was the resistance of the people of Quds. There are many stories that I learned. For instance, the caretaker of the masjid attempted to renew a slab. So the Israeli soldiers arrested him for this. So this is an action of jihad. Or the people of Palestine, Al-Quds, where they opened old parts of the masjid and resisted the Israeli soldiers. And this, of course, interrelates to our resistance in Kashmir, meaning how the Palestinians and the Kashmiris are similar in their resistance. The certainty of Iman, meaning belief, is a light from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Meaning that light, if it enters the heart, then the person, his mind will be able to comprehend belief and accept. There are some things which we term as badihi, self-evident. But sometimes something that's self-evident is not self-evident for another individual. And this leads to the discussion of belief as being nadari, meaning theoretical, where a person would have to present different arguments in order to convince the other person and create some type of certainty in the heart of the one being addressed. But the root of certainty is a light from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala places that light, a person is able to comprehend those things which are self-evident. So the existence of Allah, the truthfulness of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the Quran, is understanding this is a light from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the source of our certainty is firstly divine, a divine source that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala places a light in our hearts, which is known as Iman. But does this entail it's a blind faith? The answer is no. So many times I've discussed the impermissibility of blind conformity in belief. And that, of course, the removal of blind conformity would not entail that all belief is on rational arguments. There is a spiritual aspect to belief also. But the spiritual aspect does not contradict rational arguments. So if we form a rational argument regarding the existence of Allah, or the existence of angels, or those things which are rejected commonly by materialists, it does not entail that that belief, the rationalizing of that belief will contradict the mind, meaning it would have to go in accordance with the mind. So our spirituality goes in accordance with the rational arguments. And this is where we enter the domain of ilmul kalam, but also ilmul ihsan. Ilmul ihsan, that we worship Allah as if we see Him. What do we see him with? With our minds and our hearts, two things. Meaning atheists ask the question, how can you believe in a God you do not see with your eyes? Who said we observe Allah with our eyes in this realm? We observe Allah with our minds and our hearts. So this involves two aspects. One is the rationalizing of the belief, and the second is the spirituality of the belief. If these two go hand in hand, then a person increases their certainty and increases their Iman. But removing doubts, shubuhat, is also one aspect of increasing the Iman. Because I've realized when delivering lectures, when I remove doubts from the minds of the audience, their Iman is increased because they realize that our religion is rational, our religion is not based on irrational things. There are so many things that non-Muslims will point out, this is irrational, but if they hear the counter-argument, they will realize that many of those things are not irrational, or they will not accept. But the mutakallimin, the theologians, are able to respond to those things which are proposed as being irrational in religion. See, the story of Sayyidina Khidr alayhi salam killing the child and rationalizing this would come down to an old theological discussion, which is al-husn wal-qubhu aqliyan, meaning something being deemed as good or something being deemed as al-qubh, meaning ugly. Are these two things determined by the mind? And this is an old discussion. The Mu'tazila, the early sect, they believed good and bad is defined by the mind. While the Ahl Sunnah, the Ash'ari in particular, they said that the mind cannot determine what is deemed as being good or bad. While the Maturidis, who were from Ahl Sunnah, they said the mind can uncover some things which are bad and uncover some things which are good, but the mind does not determine what is good and bad, meaning it is not shari', it doesn't legislate. So if we understand this principle, we apply this now on every objection which people give. Meaning, there are some people, they will object to the divine laws of Allah. So they will say, why did Allah legislate this? This thing is deemed as being bad. But how do they justify something being bad? Sometimes it's through social norms. Sometimes it's through what is observed in a society. So humanist philosophy will determine something being bad by society. But in Islamic thought, we would say the only way of determining something as being bad in itself is through divine law and divine revelation. So God is the lawgiver, and God is the one who defines for us what is determined as being evil and what is determined as being good. And in that context, the story of Khidr alayhi salam, he gives the reason as to why the child was killed by Khidr at the command of God Almighty. So the question itself, even though we are the question is partitive, meaning we are concentrating on a aspect of the universal principle. What is the universal principle, and what should the question be? Does God determine what is good and bad, or do human minds determine what is good and bad? And the Islamic response, or the more specifically the Sunni response to that, would be that God Almighty determines what is good and bad, and the human mind is insufficient in determining what is good and bad. So therefore all the laws of God are good. So if we answer the universal principle, that would mean that we answer all these type of objections. That why did God legislate this? Why did God legislate that? So one of the meanings of being a Muslim is submission to the divine will. So submission to the divine law would entail that all the law is good and determined as being good by God Almighty. But the first step for a person to accept that is submission. And then, of course, the submission comes in after believing in a God. But sometimes these type of questions are utilized as objections to the very existence of God. But of course, that objection is invalidated if we say that the universal principle is that God is the one who determines what is good and bad. Some of the examples you mentioned, inheritance is half the inheritance of man. The question itself is flawed, because not in all cases do women receive half of what men receive. that is in a specific case where a father dies or a mother dies and she leaves children or he leaves children, and the siblings, the male will receive double of the female. So it's a specific case. Otherwise, there are cases where women will receive 1/3 or 1/4 or 1/8 or 2/3 or 1/3 or the entire inheritance, meaning it varies from scenario to scenario. But so the question itself, how questions are proposed, sometimes determine how people think regarding that specific issue. In this case, the case of why the male sibling receives double of the female sibling is only because the male would have to marry in the future and pay for the dowry of his wife, and the dowry would be whatever she demands, and he would have to pay for the upkeeping of his wife, so maintenance of his wife. So because of this, he is given double. While the daughter, she retains her own personal wealth. When she marries, she receives a dowry of her choice, and she receives maintenance. She does not contribute to the household costs of a marriage. The woman does not contribute. The man must pay for everything, and this is why his inheritance is doubled. So this is just one example of how something can be cited. Another example, you mentioned the witnessing of a woman is half of that of a man. So if you have one man witnessing, you would require 2 women witnessing for the same thing. Is this correct? The answer is not always. If you observe, some of the rulings require 2 women, but some of the rulings, the woman's witnessing is sufficient and the man's is insufficient. Like suckling, the ruling of suckling, if a woman comes forward and says this child was suckled by this woman, or she suckled that child, that statement of the woman overrides any statement of a man. So it is not always true that the witnessing of a woman is half of that of a man. That is in very specific cases, and that is for a reason. The cases are in trade and commerce, that men would be more engaged in trade and commerce. Therefore, the ruling is that the statement of a man would be equal to the statement of 2 women. Even today in the stock market, if someone goes to the stock market or in New York, when you observe the stock traders fighting one another, you would observe that most of them are men, meaning that environment is dominated by men. Some people reject this, meaning feminists, and they would say that this is not always true. If that were not the case, to this day, America has never had a female president, meaning there are reasons for this. Like military is always dominated by men. This is the way the world is running. But those things which are dominated by women, like childbirth, like suckling of a child, then the witnessing of a woman is not like that of a man. In fact, the witnessing of a woman overrides that of a man. So this, again, the question is not worded correctly. So with regard to rights of women, of course, this is a deeper issue than just the questions that you've asked, because some of them will say, why would a woman have to wear hijab? The response to that is, the believing woman is addressed by God Almighty to conform with the laws of Allah, which is what wearing jilbab. Jilbab is something that covers the hair of the woman and the chest and the body of a woman. But the believing woman is commanded by God Almighty. Does this mean that men can oppress women in order to enforce the hijab upon them? The answer is no. And any time we see and observe this, we will know that it's a cultural practice. Like in Saudi Arabia, the way the hijab is enforced is a cultural Bedouin practice. So the believing women are commanded to do this, and they must carry out this act. If they refuse to do so, that's between them and God. But nowhere in the Quran do you find a verse of the Quran or in the Hadith that the Prophet ﷺ, the Sahaba, went around carrying sticks and beating women and enforcing them to wear hijab, or like what occurs in some tribal areas where men carry wires and beat women and enforce them to wear the niqab, not only the hijab, the niqab, the face veil. No, the hijab is something Allah has commanded the believing women, but He has also commanded the men with certain things also, like lowering the gaze, keeping their modesty. So if men do not conform to that law, they are answerable to Allah. If women do not conform to that law, they are answerable to Allah. But men have not been commanded that wherever they find a woman who is not wearing a headscarf, remember, headscarf is insufficient for covering. The command is for a jilbab, but that they enforce the law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on women and oppress those women. So these are some things which are al-hukmu ala shay far'un an tasawwurihi. Any judgment on anything is always a branch, a subsidiary of how you conceive that thing. If you have the wrong conception of something, your judgment will be based on that wrong conception. So whether a Muslim or a non-Muslim, some Muslims will have the wrong conception of the hijab, like people in Saudi Arabia, where it's a cultural practice, where women are enforced to wear the hijab, when in reality the hijab is something the woman does with her own volition, with her own free will, as a believing woman, as we observed in Syria. In Damascus, the women would wear hijab out of free will, meaning that would inculcate more piety within the woman. And likewise, the non-Muslims or some secular people who have also the wrong concept of hijab. And of course, these extreme interpretations of the Sharia, and secularists always go hand in hand, meaning one needs the other in order to validate themselves. So you need the extreme interpretation of Muhammad bin Salman or the Saudi interpretation of things to validate a secularism. And this is why today Saudi Arabia is moving towards secularism, because they need the tribal interpretation of Islam that they have validates as secularism, and secularism would validate an extreme interpretation according to some Muslims, who then of course are recruited by groups like ISIS, because ISIS is a reaction to an observation of extreme secularism. But the natural Islam is the Islam, the Sunni Islam that we learned from our teachers. With regard to the hadith of naaqisaatul, there is a context to the hadith. The hadith refers to an incident that occurred with some young children who were girls in the chamber of the Prophet ﷺ. In that context, he said naaqisaatul, deficient of intellect. But in this regard, some of the interpretations of what has been mentioned is the following: that man and woman complement one another. How? That a man would sometimes think without emotion. When a man thinks without emotion, he will think completely from the cerebral capacity that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given him. Totally rational. And this sometimes can lead to misguided judgments. Because if you have emotion detached from a judgment, this can sometimes remove mercy from the heart. While woman has been created in order to complement man. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala placed emotion in a woman to a higher degree than what is found in men. And therefore she is referred to as naaqisaatul aql, not because her intellect is deficient, but because her emotion can be more than a man, and this is perfection of a woman, because she perfects and complements the man. Without the emotional judgments of women, men will always make the wrong decisions. And this hadith is not pointing out a deficiency in women, it's pointing out a completion, that a woman completes the man. And this is why the point of the hadith of the woman being made from the rib of the man is because if the rib is removed, the heart is damaged. So the woman protects the man. The woman is like a rib for the heart, and if she were not there, then the heart of the man would be damaged. So likewise, when the hadith states naaqisaatul aql, It's not saying that their intellect is deficient in the sense that they have less intellect and nothing to complement. No, it means that their emotions will complement the male way of thinking. The response to this is in two ways. One is that the initial objection that there are no the New Testament and the works of the New Testament were written after Sayyidina Isa alayhi salam. That is correct, but the Muslim objection is not that. The objection is that there is no asanid, chain of narration for the Gospels. So the Gospels, when they were written in a time period after the rising of Sayyidina Isa alayhi salam, being raised to the heavens, there's a gap and there is no chain of narration. If there were a chain of narration, then the chain of narration could be verified. So the Muslim objection is not regarding when the New Testament was written down, it's regarding the transmission of the New Testament. With regard to the Hadith were written down in the early period. They were written down by the companions. And the later collections that we have, the famous collections like Bukhari, Muslim and others, these later collections incorporated the earlier manuscripts. So in the early period, many of the scholars of Hadith wrote works of Hadith, like a Zuhri and others, and they were people who met the companions. They met the people who had heard directly from the Prophet, peace be upon him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But their manuscripts were small. So, for instance, the narrations of Zuhri could be compiled in a few hundred hadith. But because the later compilations were larger, why were they larger? Because they incorporated all the earlier smaller works. The earlier works were then abandoned and people adopted the later works because they had incorporated the earlier works. But when I say they were abandoned, what that means is that they were not taught and the narrations didn't continue, but the manuscripts are still found. So if you check the research of Dr. Hamidi, you will find that he does research on earlier manuscripts. But when you check those earlier manuscripts, those hadiths which are found, those hadiths are also found in Bukhari, exactly the same. So this means that the gap between the later works and the earlier works is complete, is filled through, firstly through chains of transmission, but also that the early manuscripts are also found today, meaning many of them are found. So this is a disanalogy between the New Testament and the works of Hadith. But additional to that, there is also the science of Asma'ul Rijal, verification of the chains of transmission. Idolizing a personality and glorifying them to the extent that a person, his Iman becomes tainted or weakened when the person they idolize slips, is due to, again, blind conformity. So this goes back to something which I've always emphasized, is that our belief and our Iman should not be based upon a blind conformity to individuals. The basis of our faith is rational and learning the proofs. So any alim, any scholar, any social media personality, anyone that you may look up to, if they slip, then this should not affect your Iman. If it does, then you would have to analyze your motives of following the faith. Meaning, our faith should not be based on the construct of a group, the herd mentality, that if there is something innately wrong with a group, an organization, a madrasa, an institution, a teacher, that our Iman, our faith is affected. No. Even people who may listen to my lectures, I would tell them that if they see a fault in me or they see anything wrong with me, rather than that affecting their faith, they should reevaluate why is their faith being affected. So this is something, firstly, the ulama must emphasize, that there is no blind faith in any one individual. What we follow is the Quran and the Sunnah and the Ijma', meaning which is known as Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, in Quran, Sunnah and Ijma'. And this is something which every Muslim should know to the extent of their ability. The method of countering atheism, firstly, is that across the board, within the Muslim public, we need to teach works like Ibrahim, the work of Imam Muhammad bin Yusuf al-Sanusi. Ibrahim, basic text of understanding the rationality of our faith, meaning where he discusses the ahkam, judgments of rational judgments, legal judgments, and judgments of observation, empirical judgments. This is something we need to teach across the board. So up and down the UK, I've been teaching Ahmed bin Zaini Dahlan's book on the essential Islamic creed, which is similar to Ibrahim. But after this, there is an essential need of ulama now bringing our discussions, raising the caliber of our discussions, where we need to counter atheist arguments. In reality, the shubuhat, the arguments that the atheists present are weak arguments, but because of the absence of a response in the English language amongst Anglophones, the young people may become convinced that those arguments are in fact strong. But the reality is that many of them are not exposed to our response. So not everyone will be listening to Asrar Rashid. Not everyone will be exposed to my counters to those arguments. They may never hear of these counter arguments. But after becoming convinced, then sometimes there are issues of emotional reasons why people leave the deen. Those come down to social factors. So someone who has been beaten up in a madrasa or abused by someone in a madrasa, meaning sexual abuse or physical abuse which occurs, this may lead a person to leave the fold of Islam. Those are social factors which Muslims need to take up and rectify. Meaning our religion is not like the Catholic Church where abuse occurs and then it becomes institutionalized. No, it should not be like that. But so those are emotional factors, whether they occur in an institution or in the household, in the family. Like 2 young women recently left Islam. They went to Turkey with their father. They ran away from their father. Why? Because they were beaten in their homes and forced to wear hijab. And this relates to the question you asked regarding women's rights. And one of them was a lesbian. So those are emotional factors why they are leaving Islam. There is no rationality regarding the existence of God or the Quran. But it can become intertwined with then that person attempting to find rational arguments. So they will listen to Lawrence Krauss or Richard Dawkins or someone else and then attempt to adopt their arguments and utilize those arguments, find a Muslim who is unable to respond, and then this gives them a feeling of satisfaction regarding their own disbelief. Then, aside from resolving social issues, there are issues sometimes of nufus, meaning shahwat, desires. So a young man who is enveloped or covered by his shahwat, his desires, decides to leave Islam because Islam has constraints, meaning the Sharia has constraints. There are constraints in our law that do not allow us to do certain things which someone who is overwhelmed with their desires would want to carry out. So to remove any guilt, they would remove themselves from Islam and renegade from the religion totally. So those could be other factors. So the conclusion is 3 factors: social, which is the deepest, and we have a responsibility to resolve that. The second, which is desires, which again the Muslim community would be at no fault in most of those cases. And the third is the rational, and which is a minority of people. Those are in fact a minority of people. But with the rational, someone who is inclined to being a homosexual or a lesbian will attempt to find rational arguments to justify that behavior. So majority of them are unaware that the arguments in favor of homosexuality being a natural disposition that people are born with are based on the Kinsey report. And the Kinsey report is unscientific. The Kinsey report is a flimsy research on sexuality, and is a flimsy scientific or unscientific, flimsy research on human sexuality. But the reality is children are not born with sexuality. They grow into sexuality and then they incline towards a specific sexuality. And in Islam, that would be a desire, meaning something called a shahwa, a desire that they incline towards. And they have been prohibited from certain shahwat and have been ordained or have been commanded to carry out only the natural shahwat, the natural desires. So, but people are still attempting to find arguments to justify homosexual or lesbian inclinations, acting upon those inclinations. Are they biological and is it scientifically proven? In fact, it's pseudoscience, but pseudoscience that today has convinced many people that the arguments are in fact rational. So someone who has that inclination would fall into the second category of inclining towards his desires or her desires, but then they will intertwine that with the third, which is rational argument. So these are three-pronged response that we need, especially from the scholars of Islam.
This unity can be achieved if what you mention is some of the young people are willing to move forward. So the young people should re-identify themselves as Hanafi Maturidi. In fact, in the Madaris, they teach Sharul Aqaid, they teach An-Nibras, they teach Khiyali, they teach Umur Amma. These books in Kalam are taught across what is termed as Deobandi Madaris and Brelvi Madaris. So the young generation should re-identify themselves with Sunni, Hanafi, Maturidi, or whichever madhab they belong to, Sunni, Shafi'i, Ash'ari, meaning the parameters of orthodoxy. In that case, they can achieve practical unity. But what happens is there are two problems. One is removing the label, and number two, looking at the core theological differences. So removing the label is difficult for many. So someone mentioned to me that Maulana Shafi Uthmani, when his son Maulana Rafi Uthmani, who is still alive, someone mentioned this to me, so someone can contact Maulana Rafi and ask him that once he wrote down Rafi Uthmani Deobandi, and his father reprimanded him. He said, I smell sectarianism from this signing of Deobandi, meaning the label itself. So many of the Deobandi listeners may disagree with this, that the label is fine and the label should not be removed. If that is the case, then is Deoband a university like Al-Azhar, or is it a sect? If you recognize Deoband as a university like Aligarh, meaning there are many people who graduate from Aligarh who hold different views, or Nadwatul Ulama, people graduate from Nadwatul Ulama, they have different views. People graduate from Al-Azhar and they have different views. Is Deoband a madrasa or is Deoband a sect? This is something which people need to decide. There is a disparity between Deobandi and Brelvi in the sense that Bareilly is a town from which Al-Imam Ahmad Rida Khan came from. The people who are identified as being Bareilwi are not graduates from Manzar-e Islam. That was his madrasa, Manzar-e Islam. They were ulama already, like Ahmad Surti, contemporary scholar, graduated from somewhere else, but recognized Al-Imam Ahmad Rida Khan as a scholar, as a person of profound talents, and he even quotes him in his commentary on Munyatul Musalli. Or other contemporary ulama are surrounding India who were Sunni ulama, who later became labeled as being Bareilwi, meaning that Deoband and Bareilly are not the same. Bareilwi is a label given to people who ascribe themselves to Sufi orders in the Indian subcontinent, even if they have no link with Imam Ahmad Rida Khan. So people in Ajmer, they will be called Bareilwi, even though they have no link. They have their own independent chain. People in Golra, in Punjab, in Pakistan, they have their own independent chain. people who are associated with Jamaat al-Isha. He has his own independent chain. Throughout India and Pakistan, you will find Sufi orders, they have their own independent chains. For some reason, they are all labeled as Brelvi. Those people are very happy to remove the title Brelvi. Because why are they labeled as such? Because their beliefs are the same as Al-Imam Ahmad Rida Khan. So there was no madrasa from which graduates came. Yes, there were scholars who studied with him, like Maulana Amjad Ali A'zami, Na'imuddin Muradabadi, and other ulama. But if you notice, they also studied with other scholars also. So the label Barelvi is different to the label Deobandi. But with the Deobandi label, the people who label themselves as such, are they ascribing themselves to a madrasa or to a school, a sect? Meaning a sect. This is something that needs to be made clear. So this is why it's essential, firstly, that the label be removed. And the Indian subcontinent Muslims, their original identity, aside from the Shia, is Sunni, Hanafi, Maturidi, meaning the majority of the people, with the exception of ulama in Malyabar who are Shafi'i, Ashari, which is fine, meaning within the parameters of Sunni orthodoxy. That is by removing the label. But then we go on to the core issues. There are, if we say Deobandi and Brelvi are two theological schools that have deep theological differences, then unity can never be achieved on those theological issues, because a sect, we cannot unite on heresy. So a tenet of faith must be orthodox, meaning acceptable from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So a few days ago, some Salafi youth came to my house, prominent youth locally, to discuss ways forward for the Salafi division with the Ash'ira. And I demarcated for them four major differences, justified our position on those four major differences, and said there is no way you can label us as being deviants. But there could never be unity on those tenets of faith. This would be impermissible and a contradiction, a rational contradiction. Otherwise, why would the Salaf refute deviants on their deviant positions? So the people who identify themselves as Deobandi or Brelvi, they need to demarcate those essential differences. Unfortunately, what happens is many of them will bring an issue of furu' and make that issue of furu' seem like usul. There are many of those issues that need to be removed from the discussion. Then, like issue of furu' is like the anniversary of what they term as urs. This is not an issue of usuluddin. Holding monthly gatherings on the day of Shaykh Abdul Qadir al-Jilani. This is not what is called in the subcontinent as Giyarmi. It's not an issue of usuluddin. These are issues of fiqh. So, with regard to the second category of the issues, labeling things and then misquoting the position of the opposition, this is one of the second problems that needs to be done away with. But then we come to the core issues, which are the actual theological differences. When we come down to the actual theological differences, those differences are there and they cannot just be set aside. And the only way forward is if the heretical positions are recognized and abandoned. So any heretical position, like saying Qidr, for instance, is under the Qudra of Allah, but he chooses not to lie. This, I would say, is a heretical position that should be abandoned. Now, if there are people from both sides saying that there are heretical positions from one side or heretical positions from the other side, that needs to be pointed out in meetings amongst ulama, amongst scholars who are sincere to this cause, and a joint statement should be made where the heretical positions are refuted and signed by both sides. This is the only way. So going back to the first thing, by saying that the labels are done away with, The second thing, which is do not misquote the position of one group. And the third thing is that heretical positions are pointed out and a document is made where both sides, scholars from both sides, agree that these positions are heretical and must be abandoned. This is the only way forward for unity, and this is the only practical solution, because unity upon heresy is impossible. Life in 3 words. I'll give you life in 1 word. Ubudiyah, which is servitude to Allah. So life in 3 words would be servitude to Allah. If you could travel back in time, what period would you go to and why? I would go back to the Khilafah of Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anh. Why I wouldn't go back to the prophetic period is because I am not worthy of being a Sahabi, of course, for obvious reasons, and the period had many tests and trials. But in the time of Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anh, Islam was established and guidance was clear to all, and it was the most successful period of Islam after the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and Sayyidina Abu Bakr Siddiq. But for the obvious reason that I would want to live under the rulership of Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anh. Dream travel destination. Al-Imam Muhammad bin Ahmad Safarini in his book Al-Buhur Zakhira fi Ulum al-Akhirah mentions that there is an island on the earth that has the most balanced climate. He mentions the description of that island. That would be the island I would want to go on. Favorite sports personality of all time? Muhammad Ali. That needs no explanation. What is your favorite hobby? Reading. Reading is my favorite hobby. What is one thing that annoys you the most? What annoys me the most is when people cannot comprehend what you are saying and misquote. Favorite English Seerah book? The work by Sayyid Muhammad bin Alawi al-Malki, translated by Amjad Mahmood. Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the best of creation. One must read for everyone in English after the Quran translation. So the one must read for everyone, I would say, is the Sanusi Creed, the creed of Al-Imam As-Sanusi rahimahullah, which is translated into English and available with the commentary of Sa'id Fawda. I would say that's an essential reading. Or the work Kubra al-Yaqiniyat al-Kawniyah, the greater universal certainties by a Sheikh Muhammad Sa'id Ramadan al-Bouti, translated by Mahdi Laq. This is essential reading for people in the UK. Dream job. Dream job is to be a cleaner in Al-Masjid al-Nabawi. That's my dream job. If you could live anywhere in the world, where would it be? I would live in Damascus. What is the strangest thing you've ever eaten? A rabbit. If you were stranded on an island, what 2 things would you want with you? A copy of Tafsir of Al-Imam al-Qurtubi and a copy of Mirqatul Mafatih Mulla al-Qari. Most memorable year in your lifetime and why? The year 2004. Because this was the year in which I felt my studies had reached a point where I was satisfied with some of the achievement that I had gained that year. Favorite book of all time, excluding Islamic books? Matilda by Roald Dahl.